Hello, everyone. So, today I want to talk about white identity. Now, one question I get a lot on my Curious Cat pages. Are you worried about the prevalence of white nationalist rhetoric among younger white men online? And my answer is always yes, I am. But today, I thought I'd flesh that answer out a bit and discuss these young white guys and their increasing familiarity with open white nationalism. And we gonna tell a bit of a story. We gonna talk about how this identity coalesced and gained steam during Gamergate and how it transformed into the peep avatar alt-right Trump supporting mess it is today. And the reason I really want to talk about this now is that I've been noticing a certain dissatisfaction with Trump among a lot of the frogs, and many of them, understandably, don't seem too happy with the general level of ineptitude he's displayed since coming to office. And many others are even openly expressing regret for even having voted for him. You've got the usual peep avatar people, the folks using the frog emoji in their Twitter names, and Trump's also apparently lost the support of Darth Vader, Frankenstein's monster, and Skeletor. So I also want to ask, how did all of these chumps get hoodwinked so easily? And once they all wake up to the fact that Trump was just using them all along, where are they gonna go next? Now, a few disclaimers before we start. Unlike some people, I don't think Gamergate caused Trump to become president or anything. While there was a small swing away from the Democrats among younger people, and of course Trump was definitely favored by white men, I don't really think any of these peep memes or the likes really affected the outcome of the election that much. We giving them too much credit, I think, when we suggest that. Another disclaimer. This video is not a defense of these guys. When I ran this idea past Jen, she thought it sounded like I was making excuses for them. And I don't want to do that. I'd like to try and explain their behavior and motivations, but not excuse their actions. So I thought I'd just make that clear here. I apologize if it seems like I am giving them an easy ride. And a final thing before we start. I'd like to say hello to any of these people who are watching. Hello there. Thanks for stopping by to hit dislike and call me a cuck, and so on. But once you read done with that though, I would encourage you to stick around and watch the rest of the video just for a change of pace, if nothing else. Right now, you won't agree with anything I say, and you will think I'm an idiot. But it all plant a few seeds in your head that will slowly come to fruition. And eventually, in about 2 or 3 years, you all realize that I was right about everything. That's the hope, anyway. Anyway, let's get to it. So let's set the stage. Who are these people who we re-talking about? Well, they re-nerds on the internet who are typically straight, white, cis, young, and male. Not exclusively, granted. For every one of those identifiers, you can find a few outliers, but broadly, that's who we re-dealing with. And to start off, let's try and get inside their mindset. Now, this is something easy for me, because I used to be one of these people until I grew out of it. If my parents had met 5 to 10 years later, I'd probably be watching alt-right YouTube videos and tweeting about Kyrgyzstan, whatever that's supposed to be. And that's a scary thought. There, but for the grace of God, go I. And here's the world according to the frog people. First off, institutionalized prejudice is a thing of the past. And indeed, if prejudice against minorities even exists at all anymore, it's purely on an individual level. It's a personal choice informed in no way by wider society. And legality trumps all arguments here. Minorities have the vote now, and business discrimination is technically illegal. Therefore, it doesn't happen outside of a few bad eggs. Secondly, we live in a meritocracy. If women get paid less than men, that's because they can't compete. If black people get arrested and incarcerated disproportionately, that's because they are more likely to be criminals. Everyone is on equal footing now, you see. And if anyone can't keep up with straight white men, well, that's just because they are not as good. Now, most of them know not to say this directly in the open, of course, but basically this is what they believe. And it stems, in part, I think, from a misunderstanding of history. If you don't know too much about history, it's hard to contextualize a lot of this stuff, especially if you're a younger person. Everything that happened before they were born took place sort of nebulously a long time ago, and now it's all the same as ancient history. It has no bearing at all on the modern day, or so it seems to them. For example, it was not that long ago in my own life that I realized how relatively recent legal slavery was in the West, and the effects of that system are not something that disappear overnight, obviously. Similarly with women's suffrage and so on. Speaking in terms of the span of human history, this all happened yesterday. And another factor here is just the natural tendency to want to see arguments break in your favor. You know, it's much easier to believe in a meritocracy if you are someone who is already doing okay. Or rather, and it gets a little complicated here, someone who is not doing okay but feels like they should be, and blames the fact that they are not on the enemies of the imaginary meritocracy. You know, if the playing field is naturally already level, then any attempt to advocate for any type of social minority is coming directly and unfairly at the expense of straight white men. You know, when is White History Month? Why can't we have a straight pride parade? When is International Men's Day? You see, to these young white guys, seems like everyone else but them has an identity that they allowed to be openly proud of. And that doesn't make sense if we supposed to be on a level playing field. You know, why is it that a black person or a gay person can take pride in those identities, but I'm not allowed to openly take pride in my race or my sexuality? That's not fair. Now, as a straight white man myself, I understand the answers to those questions, but that understanding came at the tail end of a lot of learning and reading and contextualizing. Perhaps more learning and contextualizing than it's reasonable to expect a teenager to have done, especially considering the state of the education system in a lot of these places in the States, but, you know, that's just the younger ones. I want to make clear. Some of these guys are in their 30s and older, so we got no sympathy at all for them. Anyway, with these minority identities come narratives. Narratives that include being oppressed and working to overcome that oppression. And now, if we don't consider all the negatives of oppression, you know, if we take the actual oppression out of oppression, it can seem quite romantic. You know, succeeding despite being the underdog is a lot more exciting and heroic, narratively speaking, than succeeding when society expects you to succeed. And among these young white men, there's definitely an unvoiced and perhaps even subconscious jealousy of being left out of that narrative. In fact, they share their identity with the oppressors in all of these narratives, you know, white over black, straight over gay, cis over trans, men over women, and so on. So it seems to them that they've been unfairly cast as the bad guy without actually having done anything wrong as an individual. So society, rather than being biased against people who aren't them, is actually therefore biased against straight white men who are not allowed to have an identity or a narrative. And I'd just like to reiterate at this point that I don't agree with any of this, and this is happening primarily in their own heads. That's just to clarify for Jen if she's listening. Now, let's first position ourselves in time a couple of years ago, and we've got a bunch of angry young white dudes on the internet without much historical, economic, or political context with which to understand the world, and they feeling increasingly left out. If something unfair or embarrassing or upsetting or disappointing happens to them, they can't say, well, it's probably because I'm white or straight or a man. You know, there's no socially acceptable explanatory narrative at hand for them to rationalize the negative aspects of their lives. In fact, society is constantly signaling to them the opposite, that they should be doing great, you know, you are the best, you should be on top, but that's not how it feels to them. And they can't openly bemoan the fate of straight white guys without being called idiot racists. So what do? Well, they displace their anger and frustration onto the one other identity that pretty much all young white men on the internet share. They all gamers. They all play video games. So, Gamergate, where the gamers finally said, we not gonna take this anymore. And everyone else said, take what anymore? And the gamers replied, we not gonna take this anymore, but louder. So I'm gonna say some things about gamers here, so full disclaimer, I play video games. I play video games. I play too many video games. I play too many games. But I've never really cared when someone insults capital G gamers, because video games are just a hobby for me, you know. They something I do for fun in me spare time. Being a gamer is not me identity. I don't to define myself by the fact to play video games, and nor should anyone else, but that's just me. Anyway, Gamergate. Now, my own experience of Gamergate was to sit on the sidelines heckling and metaphorically throwing rotten fruit at people. Now, my guilty pleasure was going on Reddit or Fortune or something awful and asking, hey, so what's this Gamergate thing everyone's talking about? You know, just to make everyone type huge text walls about what they thought Gamergate was. So for the blessedly uninitiated, what is Gamergate? Well, briefly, hopefully, in mid-Minus 2014, independent game developer Zoe Quinn was the subject of a blog post published by a former boyfriend that accused her of cheating on him with various men, including a games journalist who had previously written about her and a video game she made. So what does this incident have to do with anything? Who does it affect outside of the people directly personally involved? The answers are nothing and nobody. Of course, a couple had a messy breakup, basically, but hey, something had to light this trash fire, and it was going to be something legitimate, was it? So we stuck with this nonsense. And if you think about it, the Zoe Quinn incident is sort of the perfect storm in a teacup, to mix me idioms there. It's a minor incident, but it's got a lot of contextual multipliers acting on it. It's about a woman, which is a good start. A woman game developer. So a woman trespassing in the no woman treehouse. She had sex, which is usually a frightening concept in and of itself for self-described gamers. She allegedly cuckolded a man And of course, the most frightening type of sex a woman can have is sex that is not with me. And there's implicit fraud and deception, proving true all me suspicions about women being duplicitous harlots who will deceive me at every turn. And all of these multipliers act to make this remarkably trivial and stupid incident actually significant in the minds of certain people. And so they proceeded to organize on sites like Reddit, 4chan, 8chan, and so on, and built a movement primarily concerned with endless complaining about Quinn and various other game developers and journalists who were apparently conspiring to maliciously ruin video games for everyone using feminism. Really, though, Gamergate wasn't about Quinn or Anita Sarkeesian or ethics in video game journalism, which I think became a joke roughly 5 seconds after the first person even dared to suggest it. It wasn't even really about video games. It was about young, straight white men and their lack of an identity. In my opinion, anyway. Gaming was the one area of entertainment that they felt was still created for them. Of course, that's not true, but they felt it was true, which is the important thing. You know, gaming, being the relative newcomer among television, films, books, and the likes, been lagging behind somewhat in its representation of minorities. And it's only fairly recently that people have been talking and writing about games as if they were a real art form subject to real, thoughtful criticism. Once almost exclusively the domain of young, white male nerds, gaming's in the process of opening up to all sorts of players and all sorts of game developers and all sorts of people writing about games and what they really like and what they could and should be. And game developers are listening to all these people and games are changing. Slowly, obviously, but they are. Which poses a problem for the folks who had taken on gamer as a surrogate identity. You know, for young white guys, video games were a safe space where you didn't have to deal with all these other people and all their different opinions and narratives, and now here they come, insisting that the thing you've adopted as the central pillar of your identity, the only aspect of your identity that you feel comfortable actually openly enjoying, needs to change. And they respond to this with a hysterical ferocity that can seem inexplicable if you don't realize that in their heads they are a genuinely maligned minority. It's every bit as serious to them as they imagine the civil rights marches were for black people or the suffragette movement was for women. It's ridiculous, obviously, but lacking an easily identifiable oppressor. These young white men have simply fabricated one. They've constructed a movement and us versus them. Their narrative has become us versus the people who want. Let us have a narrative. Social justice warriors, feminists, whatever you want to call them. Whatever you They won't even let us play video games in peace anymore. They hate us and want to change us just for being who we are, which means we re-oppressed. Finally, so these communities exist now, they re-backed into a corner in their own heads. You know, their gamer identities eroding under the horrific onslaught of walking simulators about lesbians and relatively unobjectionable women saying they think female soldiers should wear more than a bikini in a battle. And it raises an interesting point. It's always the minorities that get accused of being obsessed with feminism and identity politics and so on. But in reality, those things ultimately exist to level the playing field. They are means to an end, that end being equality. Now, ostensibly, you'd think these straight white men don't have to be concerned with all this stuff if they don't want to be, you know. They don't have to go on about feminists online. There's nothing keeping them here, really. They can go and be free. Become Randy and Superman, you know, genius alpha male CEOs or whatever it is they imagine they do be in an ideal world. But that's not happening, is it? Because of course it's not. We don't live in this ideal world. We live in an often rubbish world. So let's talk politics. If you re-age 18 to 26 in the United States, then the only president you've known during your adult life has been until very recently Barack Obama. The Bush administration is a distant memory by now. If you voted for the first time you were able to in 2016, then you were 5 when the Iraq War broke out. That's scary, isn't it? So a Democrat's been at the helm for 8 years, and yet there are all these problems still in society. And of course there are excuses for the existence of all of these problems. Perfectly legitimate excuses, even. Obama came to power shortly after one of the worst economic downturns in a century. You can blame Republican obstructionism, corporate lobbying, the news media, capitalism in general. And there's at least some merit in all of these factors, especially the economic ones. There's something about huge layoffs and wage freezes and bailouts that gets everybody down, societally speaking. So what does this mean for our fresh-faced young white men? Well, they don't want to be told that this is as good as it gets. You know, tons of things suck under Obama, but at least he's not doing as bad as a Republican. You know, it's not much of a carrot, really, is it? It's true, in a sense, but nobody's getting all that excited about it. It's certainly not motivating a bunch of young white gamer dudes to go and vote for a woman, that's for sure. I mean, they haven't seen enough political cycles yet to understand the only choice they have. They've got the Republicans who have the image of being old, religious, stuffy, and uncool, and the only other option seems to them to just be more of the same. And they'll use who more than And in the boom years, the system can get away with this. You know, people have jobs, they re-earning money, things are ticking over. But then inevitably you get the bust years where suddenly young people's expectations and possibilities start diminishing. You know, compared to their parents, which is one of the main parameters by which their success in life is going to be judged, it's more expensive to go to school. It's harder to get a job. That job won't pay as much money. It's harder to afford a house. And then when it comes voting time, you have to choose between the people who are actively encouraging all of this and the people who keep promising to fix it all, but never actually seem to get around to doing it. And both parties are staffed largely by people funded by the corporations who have a stake in nothing being done. This is not much of a choice. Now, a little disclaimer here. I'm not saying both parties are the same. They re not. Particularly if you re anything but a straight white man, it is massively in your interest to vote against the Republicans. The Democrats' action on minority rights is rather lackluster, actually, in my opinion, but it's better than the open hostility of the Republicans. For straight white men, however, it is easy to see why so many were suckered in by Trump. You know, there's the obvious. He positioned himself as an anti-establishment candidate in a year where establishment candidates were incredibly unpopular. He attacked the usual stable of Republicans running, said he was gonna drain the swamp, and so on. Rarely, though for our young white goys we were talking about, I don't think that Trump's political positions were all that important compared to what Trump represented. Rito Trump Ra Pao Pao King Pao Young Wa Horduto I Vutusa while while the zero for sure you He was a fantasy, in a sense, because he was a white man who said whatever he wanted to, and he got away with it. He would openly pander to bigoted white people, and there a big market for that lately, as it turns out. His ideas are all laughable, practically speaking, anyway. A Muslim ban, a big wall to keep foreigners out. It's cartoonish and ridiculous, clearly, but none of that matters. Trump was a white man sticking up for white men when it seemed like no one else would. Make America great again. You know when. When was it great? If you re not a straight white guy, then the further you go into America's past, the worse it gets. Make America great again is a threat to most people. Now, I spend a fair bit of time listening in on the Discord server for the Reddit page for Donald Trump supporters. That's /the Donald. And I want to go into it too much right now, but as you can see here, well, you get the picture. The talk is openly racist, worrying about the future of the white race, using all the racial slurs under the sun. And I've had a few people tell me, well, is he serious, They just like his policies and all this race talk is just a joke. But honestly, get a grip. If you think this is just a joke, then you've been tricked. It's amazing. But racism actually still exists, and it's coming back in fashion. Now, over the course of Trump's term, or terms, in office, a lot of these kids are gonna drift away from supporting him as they realize he actually is just a politician who spun them a bunch of crap in order to get elected. And this brings us back around to where we started with the first bunch of suckers slowly coming around to the fact that they've been conned. So what's next? What's gonna happen from here on out? Well, it's not enough for these people to just stop supporting Trump anymore. The legitimization of Trump's rhetoric has already happened. Trump won to be the last, regardless of how he performs in office. A lot of potential future candidates will have been watching his rise to power and taking notes. And if I were doing that, then Point O'Neill on my list of tips to get elected would say, you do not have to hide it anymore. The fascists have come out of the woodwork now. The white nationalist narrative is running at full steam online, and many young white guys are flocking to it. We are past that point by now. I hope we can all agree. A cleverer person than me could write an interesting paper about how memes and icons and emojis have taken the place of the uniform, the pin and the armband and so on as the signifiers of a political movement. Now, these people will mostly all abandon Trump eventually, not because they've had a change of heart necessarily, but because they all find him a disappointment. He want to drain the swamp or make America great again, and they'll all move on to someone else promising the same things, but even bigger. So my question going forward is, what can we do about these people? How can we break them out of the spell of this resurgent white nationalism with its easy, rationalized answers for all the world's problems? Because that's the thing. It is easy. It's comparatively difficult to learn about the economy, for instance, and how that operates. But white nationalists look at complicated systemic problems like that and make them simple racial problems. It's not our banking system that's broken. It's the Jews, for example. It's not the justice system. It's a problem with black people. It's not immigration law or foreign policy. It's the Muslims. If we just get rid of facts type of person, then the relevant problem will go away. And combating this is difficult. It requires more effort to properly understand these issues than it does to believe the easy lie. So we're starting out on the back foot here, and to have some inhuman amount of belief in the fundamental goodness of humanity to think that all of these goos could simply be talked down from the white nationalist ledge. Though on the other hand, I'm sure a lot can, and I'm sure many will grow out of it, and I'd argue that as they become increasingly disillusioned with Trump over the next 4 years, it's a prime opportunity to try and change their minds. Though honestly, I don't blame anyone who doesn't have the patience to argue endlessly with the little pricks. It's like running on a treadmill. It feels like you get nowhere. Now I don't know how to ultimately solve this problem, But I do have one suggestion I think could help. They could really use another political narrative to get behind. You know, the popularity of Bernie Sanders, say, definitely proved at least the desire for a more left-leaning platform from the Democrats, which the Democrats themselves are now ignoring as much as possible instead of capitalizing on. There were even some people who swapped from supporting Sanders to supporting Trump when Sanders dropped out, which seems like an inexplicable position if you refocused on policy. It's ridiculous, but it actually kind of makes sense if you think in terms of the narrative of the political outsider. There's a hunger for politics that differ from the mainstream, and the actual specifics of how they differ from the mainstream seems not to matter to some people. And there's a way, I feel, to appeal directly to the part of these young white guys that subconsciously maybe wants to be part of an oppressed movement. And it's ironic because, economically, the answer's right there in front of them. Ecodec right there in France. I there or house or They have no choice but to take part in an impressive economic system that's heavily biased in favor of the rich. The lack of a political identity that some young white men feel could ideally be filled with a class identity. You know, still talking about real problems, but through an actually helpful economic lens instead of a misleading and bigoted racial one. Criticizing capitalism is kind of a hard sell in the States, though I understand. And I'll throw it open to the comments. You know, what else can we do to re-educate these people out of their white nationalism? And yes, I said re-educate. I want to re-educate you. You gave it a go by yourself, but you fucked up and now your brain is wrong and needs to be reprogrammed. But you fucking do way you well you do will yeah whoa, whoa, Because ultimately, if this doesn't stop, it's gonna come to blows. And I don't mean a street scuffle between a group of anti-fascists and a group of white nationalists, but potentially, well, if this movement doesn't fizzle out by itself, it'll eventually end up being stamped out. And it'd be better to solve all this with words before it comes to that. Because the white nationalists will definitely lose that fight if it happens, just like they did last time. It's an ideology that is destined to lose. So I'll leave you today with a warning for any of me fellow straight white gamer dudes who are listening. It honestly really is in your best interests to stay away from the old fascism there. It never turns out like they say it will. I promise. Thanks a lot for watching, everyone. Let me know what you think in the comments, please. I'd like to hear your feedback on this one. And you can get in touch with me on Twitter or Curious Cat if you want to ask a question. If you liked this video and would like to help me make more videos, consider pledging me $1 on Patreon. I don't run advertisements on me videos at all, and ideally, I'd like to keep it that way. However, sadly, I do still need to eat. And it turns out they don't let you opt out of paying for food just because you don't like capitalism. If you're broke right now and you can't afford to pledge anything, I also accept payment in the form of photographs of genitals. I am really kidding. Please do not send me photographs of your genitals.